Hello, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to a special edition of Logic Apps Live, where we are going to focus on our new BizTalk server migration tooling. I'm John, and I'm joined by Beck and Valerie on the team, but we also have a couple of special guests as well, which I shall get to in a moment. So let's quickly go through what we wanted to cover today. Obviously, just kind of kicking this off, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of the OSS project and kind of why we've decided to create an open source tool from the get-go. And then we're going to get into the tool design, the GitHub repos, kind of how it all hangs together. And you'll see a lot of information there about that, because what we want to help you do is kind of get a good understanding of not just what the tool does, but how we built it, and how you can kind of understand better how it does what it does, so you can look if you're interested in actually extending the tool as well, and making additions to it. Then we're going to dig into the conversion process and kind of how that all works. And then we'll cover some next steps in terms of this being our first community call, our first kind of Logic Apps Live community call, how often you think we should do this, and any feedback and questions that we have, so allowing some time at the end. But just super quickly, because I think it's kind of interesting for us and hopefully for you as well, like why we have kind of created this tool and why we've made it open source. And honestly, the answer is pretty simple. It's like we know that we can't do everything at once in an initial release without spending years kind of building something. So we really want to kind of build this thing out in the open. So what we've got to is what we feel like is a pretty solid initial release that does some interesting and useful things in terms of BizTalk mapping to Azure integration services and Logic Apps, of course. But by then being able to ship that on GitHub gives you the ability to see what it does and doesn't do in fine-grained detail, and actually be able to contribute and extend and enhance it as well. So this is really your tool as much as it is ours, I would say, and directed at customers who may just want to use the end product, but also those of you who are partners, which may be more interesting in terms of how you can kind of make use of the tool with your customers as well, because it's pretty interesting and pretty sophisticated in how it does what it does. So, with that being said, I will make a couple of introductions and I'll hand over to them in turn. We're joined by Andrew Rivers from 345 Technology and Dan Probert from Affinis. These two people and companies have been working with us over the last few months during a private preview period, and some of you have been involved in that as well, working with some of our key customers in validating the tool and making sure we have a good initial solid release. So with that, I will turn off sharing so you can see everybody, and I will hand over to you, Andrew, to take it away.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to get up my slideshow. So hopefully that will it's not actually sharing at the moment.
It's not.
So I don't know what we've got with Teams. So bear with me a moment. I'm not sure whether actually not sure whether there's so maybe if I share it from my dev machine. There we go. That was I've never had that before when we couldn't share a PowerPoint in Teams. But let's just let's just run the slideshow from here. Okay, so so I'm going to talk about the design of the BizTalk Migrator and the code and the repos and how all that fits together. So yeah, we've been talking. Yeah, there's been a few things said so far about BizTalk Migrator. There was a little bit of it presented at Ignite, and then obviously some of it on Logic Apps Live last week. And so far, the communications have concentrated on what the tooling does and what it produces. So obviously what it does is it migrates your BizTalk app into an integration app on Azure. And we talked a little bit about what it produces. So, it produces a report and it produces templates and artifacts that you can deploy to create your app in Azure. And yes, the initial release of the BizTalk Migrator, just like John was saying, it's got limited coverage of BizTalk because BizTalk's a massive product. And so so the BizTalk Migrator has covered the most common features of BizTalk, but we really want to have other people's contributions to the open source project. I know myself, my company and Dan's company, we've been really keen on getting some feedback into this, but we really want everyone else to do that. And so what we're going to look at today is the design and some of the code, so that those of you who really want to take this and to get some of the other features of BizTalk working that aren't working at the moment, you can get an idea of how the whole thing fits together, and you can maybe implement the bits yourself if you find something that you need that's missing. You'll at least have the picture of how it works, so that you can make that contribution yourself. So I'm going to go right back to some of the design goals, because if we know what some of the design goals actually are for the BizTalk Migrator, it helps understand why it's broken down in the way it is. So obviously design goal number one is to convert BizTalk applications into Azure Integration Services apps. But also it leaves the door open to support other integration technology in the future. So for example, I don't know, TIBCO or WebSphere or something like that, we can have other integration technologies and use the core of the tool to convert those as well. The tool's delivered as a command line interface. But again, what if that isn't the way that everyone wants it to run? What if actually we want it to run as a wizard, or what if we want it to run as a web app? So we want to make sure that we don't close off those routes to deliver the tooling in the way that you want. So and also the tool needs to be extensible. So there is a minimum feature set in the tool, and it's important that it's easy for contributors to add more functionality. So and that means you need to be able to plug in your own bits without breaking everything else. So just a really good kind of separation of concerns, and just make sure that everything can be built as individual components and composed together. And finally, there's been a bit of change in Logic Apps lately, with Logic Apps run on the function framework, and Logic Apps are maybe going to be runnable on premise as well. And so so we don't want to tie ourselves into a particular flavor of Logic Apps when we know that Logic Apps is a moving and evolving technology in itself. So here's an image you may have seen. Last week, Rebecca did a really good run through on this tool, a run through of this slide, saying what each of these different stages did. So how the sequence of events happens in the BizTalk Migrator. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but from the design perspective of how the design works behind the scenes in making the tool work like this. So you'll see at the top of this that there's a BizTalk application migration in-memory object model. So there's a model that sits behind the scenes that is gradually being developed as the tool runs, and you can see that we've got all these different stages. So we've got discover, parse, analyze. Those are stages of execution, and each of those stages can read and write to the object model. The only one that only reads is the report, because the report is rendering information that's already been created in the object model. But it's important that we have the concept of stages. So we go through a number of stages in sequence, and then within those stages, you've got the other boxes underneath those, and those are different components within a stage, and we call those stage runners. So a stage runner is a component that runs within a stage. So and so those are kind of the key concepts of, you've almost got a matrix of all the different stages, and then the stage runners that sit below them, and they all work against the same object model. So I'm now going to move on and talk about the way all those work in terms of the various packages. So, on the left, you've got your BizTalk app that you want to migrate, and on the right-hand side, you've got your shiny new Azure Integration Services app, and in the middle sits Azure Integration Migration. So the BizTalk Migrator isn't just a unitary thing. It's made of a number of packages that together compose an application. And the core of that is the repo that you'll find in GitHub called AIM core, and that is the core runner. So there's a few things in here that are really, really important. And going back to that diagram before, that there are the key interfaces. So there's stage runners. So there's an interface called iStageRunner, and then in addition to that, there are other interfaces which say which stage a component might sit in. So you've got iStage Discover, iStage Parse, iStage Analyze, so that when the tool runs at runtime, the core runner will be pointed at a particular folder on your machine, and it will find all the assemblies under that folder, and it will reflect on them and find all the components that implement those interfaces. And so it'll get a big list of staged runners, and then it will say, well, which stage do these belong to? So it will segregate them into stages, and then it will say, what order do I need to execute them in? And then it will just simply take that list of stage runners and do the discover ones first, execute them in priority order, and move through that sequence of stages until the tool completes. We've also delivered the tool as a command line interface. So we've got AIM tool there, so that and that really provides the runtime. So everything you see in AIM tool is all about the command line, but because that's the command line is the entry point into the application. AIM tool is where the documentation is as well. And we also talked a lot about that in-memory object model. So that's in a separate package called AIM model. Now the object model, the in-memory model, has what is called a source model and what is called a target model. So the target model represents your Azure integration app, and the model is quite opinionated on that you're always populating an Azure app. However, the source app is intended to be overridden. So depending on which technology you're migrating for, you'll have a source model that represents that technology. So in this case, a BizTalk app. So when we want to migrate a BizTalk app, that's where the AIM BizTalk repo and that package comes in, because the first thing that contains an object model that is specific to BizTalk. So which contains schemas, maps, orchestrations, pipelines, all those subscriptions, all those BizTalk things that are they're in there. So that overrides the source model. And then we have the components, all the stage runners, so that the components that discover BizTalk apps, that parse them, analyze them, those are all in that repo. And it also contains some YAML files that control a little bit about how the BizTalk app is converted into an Azure app. And finally, there is the AIM Azure repo. Now that contains the Azure templates. So the combination of the information that's built up in the model and the templates, those get merged together, and those produce the actual deployable artifacts that can be deployed and create your app in Azure. So that is the BizTalk Migrator as it stands at the moment. So I'm just going to go through a few of the possible future extensibilities and where those fit into that picture. So if we look at the top here, so if we wanted to make a wizard, or if we wanted to make a web application, then theoretically you could swap out the AIM tool and put those components in there. Everything else underneath it would stay the same, and you'd deliver a BizTalk Migrator but in a different format. Similarly, if you wanted to have different flavors of your app in Azure, so let's say you wanted to have a performance optimized low latency app, or you wanted to make something that was industry optimized, maybe EDI or maybe HL7, you could work in the templates area and produce a different set of templates that would be optimized for that. At some point in the future, maybe if Microsoft wanted to help people migrate off other integration technologies, you could swap out the AIM BizTalk package and put in packages that support other technologies, and the rest of the tool would work the same, and you'd still end up creating integration apps in Azure. And finally, the target model represents an integration app in Azure. So there's the possibility later that you could make a modeling application that simply where you could model an integration app and publish it, and the tool could then do the code generation so that you generated all your artifacts to literally go from model into Azure with almost no barriers. So that's a picture of where all those repos fit together and why they are separate, and it's just to anticipate all those different scenarios. Now, one of the things we're really kind of keen on, and why we're talking about this now is in this stuff now is really, getting your help in helping us extend the migrator, and so the main places you're likely to be looking are, I mean, firstly, there's the documentation. So as all of us are using this tooling more, we learn more about it and we can make contributions to documentation. So the first port of call may be to go into the documentation in the AIM tool repo and to add some more content in there. But if we actually want to expand the amount of BizTalk that we cover, so let's say we want to support the POP3 adapter, or we want to do a blob storage adapter or something like that, then we need to be working in, down here. We might want to change the analysis rules to support those and the conversion rules. We might even want to make some sample scenarios that help us test that. And also we're going to need templates for that. So we're going to need templates that allow us to deploy those adapters and produce deployment scripts for them. And we also have Liquid templates. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Liquid. It's a technology that came from Shopify, and I think of it as like it's XSLT for JSON. So just whereas XSLT allows you to take a template, merge XML with it, and you get an output, it's that sort of thing, but for JSON files. So it has its own syntax, but you have a template and you merge your data with it, and then you get an output. In our case, we're looking at ARM templates and we're looking at PowerShell scripts for Azure. So those are the areas you're likely to be working in first. And so what I'm going to do now is just walk through those repos and have a look at them in a little bit more detail. So all the repos sit under the Azure organization in GitHub, and I've starred them all, so it's easy to find them, because there are about 1,500 repos in the Azure organization. So it's a bit of a needle in a haystack, but they're all prefixed with AIM. They're all prefixed with Azure Integration Migration. And so what we'll look at first is the AIM tool. So the first thing you might look at in the AIM tool is that this is where the documentation sits. So there's a bit of an at a glance README, but if we click on the documentation, that takes you into the introduction, quick start guide, user guide, developer guide. So that's definitely the first place to start in terms of getting up to speed, is to go to the AIM tool repo, look at the docs, and get started from there. The other repos that we're going to have a quick tour of are the AIM BizTalk repo and the AIM Azure repos. So here's AIM BizTalk. So there's a few things in here just to point out. So what I've done is I've forked this repo and cloned it. So the config, we mentioned that there's YAML files that control how the tool generates the BizTalk app in Azure. Those are under the config. There's a scenarios folder. So these are test scenarios. So these are the ones that so for example, when Valerie was demonstrating last week, the FTP pass-through, there is a scenario here, and in this we have both the BizTalk source code and we have an exported BizTalk MSI, so that using the scenarios you can get the MSIs and you can run the BizTalk Migrator against some pre-canned scenarios just to see how that behaves. And then we've got the source folder as well. So the main thing to point out in here is that we have the stage runners. So these are the stage runners that get discovered by the tool. And there's a folder for all the different stages. So discover, parse, analyze, report, convert. So they're all in here. So for example, in discover, we've got a couple of different stage runners. So the first discoverer is the one that discovers MSIs, and then the second one is the one that actually unpacks the assemblies that are within the MSI. And then there's a whole bunch of analyzers. So so there's a lot of work in the analysis. But what these tend to do, because there is so much code in these, that they in turn call out to other assemblies that actually do the heavy lifting for them. So these other projects within the solution are where all the work really happens. So for example, if we look at the conversion rules, then there's a whole ton of conversion rules. You can see those, send port analyzer, schema analyzer, FTP receive port analyzer, message box analyzer. There's a lot of code going on there to actually do this conversion. There's been a lot gone into this. And finally, I'm going to quickly take you on a tour through the AIM Azure repo and some of the things that are in here that are useful to note. So we've got source and we've got templates are the best places to look at here. So in the source, we have all the different pieces of the application of an Azure application, and these are actually deployable Azure artifacts. So when we break this down, things like the message box is part of the message bus. Things like pipelines and pipeline components become intermediaries, and adapters are endpoints. And communication between these things is channels. So, for example, if we look at the endpoints, then we've got the different adapters that we're supporting. So, file, FTP, HTTP, and then if we look inside there, we've got receive and send, and then if we look inside that, that's where we've actually got the deployment and deploy and tear down PowerShell scripts, and we've got the things like the ARM templates for a receive adapter. Now these are the raw kind of, you could actually deploy these into Azure yourself. So these templates are the end state, as it were. These represent the end state, but what they need to do is they need to be converted into liquid templates so that they can be merged with data and then create the finished application. So, for example, when we get to the endpoints again and look at the FTP, these all end up being .liquid files, and effectively liquid then just has this sort of double curly brace notation where we point to which bit of a piece of data we're looking to pull out, and then that will then output a JSON file, but populated with data from the object model. So the process for a new adapter would be to first of all create the end state in the source folder, and then to convert those into liquid templates, and those would sit in the templates folder, and then they can be picked up by the conversion rules in the AIM BizTalk code, and then use that to generate your adapters. So there's a pattern there for obviously one-way adapters. There's a pattern there for HTTP, the request response adapters. So it shouldn't be too hard, I don't think, to build on that and to make examples of all the other type of adapters that are in that we need to support in BizTalk over time. So that's my lightning tour of the code and the repos. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Dan, and Dan is going to talk you through more of the conversion and how that all works.
Alrighty, thanks, Andrew. Okay, now we switch over and I start sharing my screen. So hopefully that is now visible. Alrighty, so Andrew helpfully took you through the design of the tool and the repos and the source code and the sort of flow that works. So I'm going to take you guys through what happens when it runs and what it generates. Because I guess if you guys are running the tool and you've seen what it outputs, it can be a bit confusing at first to try and work out all the bits and pieces that are there. So this is going to be sort of I don't know, we haven't got that long to go through it all, and we could spend hours talking about everything, but this is going to be a sort of quick overview of the important bits that you need to know. So, and this is through our work, working with the tool and working out all it does. But after the tool has done this discover and parse phase, where it's looking for all the BizTalk artifacts and is processed it through and gone through the MSIs and unexpanded everything or expanded everything and worked out what's in there. Andrew showed you some of the rules that were run, the analysis stage rules are run across it. And what it ends up doing is it's building a model of the Azure resources that need to be created. And the way it does that is it's working on this idea of enterprise patterns, so enterprise integration patterns. So it's breaking everything that's in the BizTalk MSIs, everything it finds in the BizTalk model, if you like, down into simpler patterns that can then be converted into something that can be deployed to Azure. So as an example, we end up with something called a message bus, and that's kind of like the core app that contains artifacts and code that any integration application would need. So for example, key vault, config storage, things like that. And I'll go through that and show that in a minute. And then there's a system application, and that's kind of the equivalent of the BizTalk system application. So it contains things that you'd be familiar if you were in doing BizTalk development, like a JSON encoder and a flat file encoder and things like that. And then you have your application, so whichever application that you've converted. And then the other things that go into the model are things that you might not see directly, but the messages. So what messages can be discovered? So they're based upon, in BizTalk, we use XSDs and schemas to define messages, or you might use something different inside an orchestration. Then there's endpoints. So, a receive port / receive location represents an endpoint. But then so does a send port. So, entry and exit from your system. Intermediaries, which again is an enterprise pattern. So it's like a processor of some sort. And then channels, which link everything together. So in the model, that is actually built up. And what we've noticed is that when you run the CLI, there's actually an option to output the model. And you can have a look at that, and you can modify that model and then tell it to convert that model, convert the one that you've modified. So after it's done analysis, the tool is going to run a conversion stage. And conversion stage is effectively where the tool will generate all the templates. So Andrew showed in the repos that there are liquid files that represent all the artifacts that are going to be created. So, if there's a logic app that's being output, then you'll find a liquid or a set of liquid files, liquid templates that represent that logic app. Ditto with the APIM resources that are created, the integration account, everything is there. And because it's all there, it means it can be changed. So you can actually modify that code yourself. You can actually, bring the tool down and modify that code, or if there's a bug or something like that. I think John will talk about this later in terms of contribution, but we've already come across a few bugs in the tool and suggested changes as well. But it's that type of thing. It's fairly easy to follow what's being created once you get your head around, where everything fits. So the resource that will be deployed to Azure, there's the output of the tool is going to be one of 5 different things. So we've got ARM templates that everyone knows and loves. We've got ARM template parameter files. We've got Azure CLI PowerShell scripts. So if you're not familiar with the Azure CLI, it's kind of an alternative to ARM templates, using a CLI style for creating resources in Azure. Not everything supports it today, but what the tool does is it outputs a combination of both ARM template and Azure CLI scripts. And then there's what I'm calling deployment scripts, which are the scripts that kick everything off. So every resource that is output has a deployment script and a teardown script. And then there's a master deployment script and a master teardown script, which I'll show in a minute. And what that means is that if you've run the tool like us and you end up with all these resources, you've probably got a CI/CD pipeline. So you might be using DevOps pipelines, or you might be using GitHub Actions, but you can just take the ARM templates and the CLI PowerShell scripts and bring those into your pipeline as well, if you want. The other cool thing that I've used quite often is that when bug fixes happen to the tool and there's an updated version of something, what you can do is run the tool again and then just deploy whatever is that's been fixed. So if one of the common logic apps has a bug in it, and you've downloaded a newer version of the tool and run it with the fix in it, then all you have to do is go to the folder and deploy that one logic app, which is quite simple to do. Right, so if I show you all the types of things that we get, I think I mentioned earlier on that we've got the message bus, and inside the message bus are common artifacts that you'd expect to see in any integration application. And I know one of the questions that someone I'd heard ask in an earlier webinar was, do you end up with a separate message bus and system application every time you run the tool? Well, the answer is no. If you had 15 applications that you were deploying, you'd only end up with one message bus and one system application, but you'd end up with multiple application resource groups that represent the actual BizTalk application you're migrating. So in this case here, the message bus contains things like the config store and the routing store. So the config store stores basic configuration information about what's going on in the tool, and the routing store, or the routing store, contains the routing slips that are being used. They're both implemented using Azure App Config, if you're familiar with that. And then the artifact store is an integration account today. So that's where your schemas and maps and everything like that. And so there was a question the other day saying, do you have to use an integration account with this? And that's kind of a question for the Logic Apps team, because the actions in a Logic App that handle flat file decoding and JSON decoding and XML validation, XML transform, they all need an integration account. And then there's an instance of Azure API management, and within there are 3 APIs: a config manager, a routing manager, and a messaging manager. Then you've got Key Vault and storage, and you've got some functions that sit behind API management and do some work. And then what I've left off here is App Insights, which is also deployed as well. So all of those things are deployed for any application. In fact, if you gave it an empty BizTalk MSI and there was nothing in it, you'd still get a message bus. You'd still get all this. And it's kind of cool, actually, because these things can be reused. You can build an integration application, and I've done this already. You can build an integration application on top of this in AIS without using BizTalk. You don't even have to migrate from BizTalk. You can just use this stuff. And then the other thing we get is the system application. So the system application is pretty much all the things that, as a BizTalk developer, you'd expect to see. So we've got JSON encoder and decoder, and there's a flat file decoder in there, and topic publisher, and a content promoter, and a content demoter, and there's a lot in there. There wasn't room to put them all on this slide. The other thing that's in there, though, is a service bus namespace. So the BizTalk message box has been implemented as a service bus topic, and there are other additional topics as well. So there's a suspend queue topic, and then there's a response handler topic, which is used for request response scenarios. And then all the subscriptions that are created for each of the applications are in there as well. And then you have your actual applications. So if I've got a single MSI, so let's say I've got one of the sample scenarios, and I'm doing the FTP pass-through scenario, I'd end up with a single application representing that. And in there, I'd expect to find my receive ports and a send ports and a topic subscriber. Process manager is the name the tool uses for orchestrations, and that's something that we won't have time to go into today, but you can start to migrate orchestrations across, and they come out as a process manager. And also your API connections if you need them. And those are all the things that are specific to your application. So if you think about it from a BizTalk point of view, and this really helped me understand what the tool was generating, is that if I'm looking at BizTalk, then, and I have, say an FTP receive port using the XML receive pipeline in its location, then the config for that receive port is and receive location is specific to my application. But the XML receive pipeline is not. That's a common component. The config for it is definitely specific to me, to my application and my specific receive port receive location pair. But the actual code that's running under the covers, or the pipeline components, they're not. So that's why they appear in the system application, because they're common components that can be reused by any application. So if I had 5 MSIs, and you can do this with the tool, if you've got 5 completely independent MSIs and you run them through the tool, you'll end up with 5 separate applications here, 1 system application and 1 message bus. The only thing to say about that is one of the things you'll notice when you run the tool is it needs a unique deployment ID. And that unique deployment ID is there because certain artifacts in Azure are globally unique. So for example, a storage account, because it's effectively a DNS name, your name of your storage account with, what is it, .azurestorage.net or something at the end, that name is unique across the whole world, across all Azure regions. So because of that, the deployment unique deployment ID is a suffix that is put at the end of all the resources to make them unique, because the rest of it tends to be generic, especially for the system application and the message bus. So your config store name for me is going to be almost identical to the config store that, say, Andrew creates, with the exception of this unique deployment ID at the end. Right, so enough talking. Let's get on and actually have a look at some of what's being created here. So I'll move that out of the way. I'm hoping everyone can see what's here. What we have here is the output of running one of the scenarios. In this case here, I've run the FTP pass-through scenario. I will make this bigger if it's hard to see. But there's a folder that is generated when you run the tool, and inside there we have the HTML report that's been talked about before. We've got an unpack folder, and inside there are all the BizTalk artifacts that have been unpacked. But then we have the conversion folder, which is what we're really interested in. And this conversion folder contains all the scripts and the Azure templates that have been generated by the tool. So there's a deploy all and a teardown script that the tool generates. And if you look at the deploy all script here, I'll make that bigger. All it's doing is it is running every single script in order. And I've looked at the code that does this, and all it does is it gathers every single deploy script and looks at the number on it and deploys them in the order that are here. So that's all that does. It's not designed, from my understanding, it's not designed to replace, a proper pipeline. It's just a quick and dirty way that if you've run the tool and you have a subscription and you want to deploy everything, you can just run this. It's not guaranteed to work, but it should work in certain scenarios. And I'm going to talk about those scenarios very briefly. If we go and look at what's in the message bus here, you'll see that we have a number of different folders. I'm really wishing I had made the font size here bigger, but I don't think I have time to do this at the moment. However, what we've got in here is we have the artifact store. So this is an ARM template that creates the integration account, and it's some deployment scripts with it. We have something called the config manager. And again, that is creating an APIM API. So it's an ARM template that's creating an API in API management that allows access to configuration entries, and from what I can see, caches them as well. There's the message bus group, which is the resource group that everything is inside. Message bus ops, which is the app insights resource that is created. The message bus service, and there's quite a bit inside here. But what's going on in here is you have the actual API management being deployed, and there's a custom role for logic apps for security, and there's an app service plan. So there's quite a lot happening inside this one in the message bus service. The messaging manager, which again is an APIM API, but it's also a function. So there's a function behind it that does work, and that function has an API management API in front of it. The routing manager, so again, similar to the messaging manager, it's an APIM API plus a function that is deployed as well. The routing store, which is just Azure App Config. So the actual Azure App Config creation happens in here. And then there's an APIM that sits in front of it as well, APIM API. In fact, that's an interesting one, Key Vault as well, actually. One of the questions from someone early on was, what if you have an existing integration account and you want to use that? Well, you can actually just come in and modify everything that's here. So if I wanted to modify the app config that's being generated here or change its SKU, I can edit it here, and I can see that it's creating the parameters passed into it are the SKU that's being used, which is free. You could change that to standard, and also the name of app config that's been created. So you could change that as well. If you had an existing Azure App Config install, then you could just modify this to be your one. You'll have to modify it in a few other places as well, because it's referenced by API management. And then we have the workflows. So the only logic app that exists in the message bus is something called the routing slip router or the routing slip router, depending on what continent you're from. And all that does is it's a pattern. It picks up a routing slip, works out where you currently are, works out where you need to be next, and calls the next step in the route. That's it. It's fairly simple. Right, that's the message bus. So you always get one of those, and there should only be one of them per deployment, or per deployment using the same unique deployment ID. If I change the deployment ID, it would deploy a second message bus. But if you're using the same deployment ID each time, you'll only get one. Right, under applications here, we have the system application. So as I mentioned earlier, that's the equivalent of the BizTalk system application. And I was very quickly looking to see if there was any way to make the text bigger really, really quickly, but I think I'll leave that. Inside the system application, there's a whole lot of different things here. There's what are called channels. Now, the channels are represented in the model. They're a pattern, but in AIS, they're implemented as topics in a service bus namespace. So there's a message box channel. And it happens to be that this channel also creates the service bus namespace. So in here is a deployment script for deploying a service bus namespace. And then there's subscriptions, common subscriptions that get created as well. And then ditto, there's a message box response topic and a suspend queue topic. Then we have endpoints. So under endpoints, there's only one. An endpoint in this case is a message constructor, which is a common logic app that generates messages. It wraps an envelope around things. There's a lot more here than I'll have time to talk about. But if you think about everything that BizTalk does, if I give it an XML message, if I'm inside an orchestration, I don't necessarily see it, but that is wrapped inside an XLangS message. So, and you see that if you're writing, custom components for an orchestration or a pipeline or something like that. BizTalk does a lot of stuff behind the scenes for you. And some of that is actually brought out into here. So every message that's received by your application here in AIS is wrapped in an envelope. Then we have the resource group here for the system application, and we have all the intermediaries. So these are the things that people are probably interested in. There's a flat file message processor here, a JSON decoder, a JSON encoder. All of those use the AIS action. So there's a flat file encode and a flat file decode action, and a JSON decode, JSON encode action. Topic publisher is a generic logic app for publishing any given message to a topic. And then there's an envelope wrapper. XML message processor is the equivalent of the XML disassembler. So it handles things like promoting certain properties, calculating the message type, for example, in BizTalk. and doing things like that. So it does the same sort of thing. And then there's a XML translator and XML validator as well. So that's and then there's under workflows, there's just a response handler and a suspend processor, which are common workflows used by a number of logic apps from what I can see. Okay, so then we come back out here, and then we go to the actual application that's from BizTalk. So as I mentioned earlier, the system application and the message bus application are common. This one here, AIM FTP pass-through, is my BizTalk application, so the MSI I had. And they always have, AIM dash and then the name of your BizTalk application. So if I gave it 3 MSIs, I'd end up with 3 folders here, each representing one of the MSIs. And inside here, what I'm going to find are the endpoints. As I mentioned earlier, an endpoint can be the equivalent of a receive port / receive location and a send port. So in this case here, I have an FTP receive location and I have an FTP send port. And then intermediaries, in this case, there's only one, there's a topic subscriber. So I think I mentioned earlier that if you think about it from a send point of view, in my send port, the subscription for that is going to be unique to my application. So I can't really have a common subscription that can be used by other applications. So the topic subscriber is a logic app using a subscription that is unique to your specific send port. Yeah, so that is how the application is subscribing to a message and then sending it out via whatever adapter you were using is handled by an endpoint in here, which in this case is FTP. And then group is the resource group, and intermediaries we've just covered earlier. So that's everything that makes up all the applications, or an application when you do a conversion. And when you deploy it, you get something that looks like this. So this is it deployed in Azure. We have 3 resource groups, and inside here, the message bus, we'll see everything I just talked about, the functions and APIM and everything. The system application has all those logic apps and service bus, or all the BizTalk, the ones we'd be familiar with from BizTalk. And then here we've got our application here, in which case this is the FTP one, and they're tagged. So the application has a name that matches the MSI. So it's AIM dash and then whatever your MSI was called, and then an environment as well. One of the interesting things about tagging with an application like this, and this is a suggestion we had for Microsoft, is that you could use this to start and stop an application. So in BizTalk at the moment, if I stop an application, it stops everything in there, all the send ports and receive ports and everything else. It'd be possible just to write a script that said, find all the resources with that tag and just enable or disable them. So the tagging is really, really useful. All right, there's a lot more I could cover. I could talk about configuration and scenarios and everything like that, but we'll leave that for another time. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm hoping that has given everyone sort of a 10,000-foot overview of all the different things that are created when you run the tool. And with that, I think I hand back over to John.
Yes, thank you. Right, let me pull up the final slide. Try and pull up the final slide. Good stuff, really interesting, and thanks Andrew as well. For some reason I can't present, so I will just talk to it. So what are the next steps here? What we really want to do is understand from you when you think we should meet next. We're thinking either sort of 2 or 4 week cadence for this. There's a ton of stuff that we can cover. We've really just scratched the surface here. So I throw that out to you, and please kind of reply with your thoughts in the chat window when you want to get back together again. And kind of related to that, what we want to kind of help you get to is a stage where you may feel like you want to participate as well, and maybe present something, usage of the tool, things that you're doing, extensions that you're working on, whatever it is. It would be great to kind of hear that from you now. Maybe now is a little early, but hopefully in the next couple of calls, you've had a chance to dig into everything, and all the content that Dan and Andrew have been sharing piques your interest to go take a closer look and have a dig around. So I just kind of throw that out there as well, that we really want this call to be as much about your participation as well as ours, which is why we invited Andrew and Dan here, honestly, for the first call. And the only other thing is we've set up a new kind of email alias for the team, so you can reach out to us and ask questions offline as well, which is biztalkmigration@microsoft.com, and I'll paste that in the chat window in a second. So with that, I'm just going to pop over to the chat window and see if we have any questions from all of you that we can answer right now. And again, I'll sort of look to the rest of the team who are on the call as well to sort of lean in here and help answer them as well.
So Bill, you've got some great questions there. Dan, I don't know if you want to pick any of those up first.
Yeah,
or
for
you,
sure.
or do you want me to pick them up?
Well, I think I can answer both of those, I think. Hey, Bill. So the first question from Bill is any thought been put into passing in a configuration file that contains all of your existing Azure resources, like Azure API Management, App Config, Key Vault, Service Bus namespace? Yes, we've had discussions with Microsoft about this, and there's a number of different ways that could be addressed. To tell the truth, probably the easiest way at the moment is to provide a script that you would run after you've run the tool, and you give those values, and it would do it. We had some suggestions when we were first working with the tool that maybe it could be passed in very early on, but I think it's quite difficult because everyone has a completely different, Azure setup, Azure infrastructure. So it's quite difficult to come up with something that's going to work for everyone. But I think it shouldn't be that difficult to write a script where you could say, well, I've run the tool, but now I want to use my own APIM instance, my own Key Vault instance, and it would just go and change the values, everywhere before you did a deployment. I assume that would be good enough. Yeah. The other thing too is the use of APIM. So that's an interesting one, and I can see there's a couple of discussions going on about that. Yes, it's a curious thing that most people assume that Azure is going to be free. So you're always trying to decrease your costs. But as someone quite rightly pointed out, Eldit, hi Eldit, is that if you've come from BizTalk and you're paying, quite a lot, unless you're on an educational license for BizTalk, then you're paying money anyway. So this is still, from our point of view, at least for the clients we're working with, it's still a cheaper thing. But from what I understand is APIM is there for caching. The Azure app configuration does not have built-in caching yet. So whereas API management does. So without API management, there's no ability to cache each call to get a config item or routing slip. Every time you want a routing slip, it will go away to app config, and app config performance isn't great. So APIM is there to provide that caching. I think if it was possible to use a different cache, so say you had Redis cache in there, or Azure App Config was doing caching, then you probably wouldn't need APIM, because APIM isn't doing anything other than making a call to Azure App Config or to an integration account, or fronting a call to a function. So yes, it would be possible to look at removing that, but I guess it's there because it separates, it's a separation of concern. It means you can change what's in the back without having to change what's in the front. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Another question, though, while you're chewing on the answer, is from Swami. How does the party configuration get migrated to for an EDI application to Azure? We already actually have a tool for that. I'm just going to paste the link in the window. So it's something we released a couple of years ago that can take the EDI configuration, the partners' agreements, and set up from a BizTalk environment, and do the conversion of all of that into Logic Apps, into an integration account in Logic Apps with all the partner and agreement information already set up. So that should answer that question. And then another one, SSO app config. I guess a similar kind of question around application configuration. How can we migrate SSO to Azure? I think the general question, I don't know if Dan or Andy, you want to lean in here as well, but I think the general question is, yes, to the point that we don't provide migration for everything right now. If you're using SSO to store app config, then there are places you can do that in Azure to move across, but we haven't tooled the conversion of that yet. I'm kind of interested in the exact use cases, how much of kind of SSO you're using for that, whether you're creating the applications in SSO and then putting settings in there, because that's a pretty simple name value pair kind of lookup stuff that should be pretty easy to replicate in Azure. But it's obviously something we can look at to add to the tool in the future.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. I mean, at the moment, the BizTalk Migrator runs against an exported MSI, so by default, there is no SSO that comes with that. So things like credentials and that sort of thing, you'd need to put those in the in the templates. It would be possible to make a different discoverer that you maybe pointed at the BizTalk management database and actually went into the BizTalk databases. So maybe that's something that that someone can take on as a little side project, is actually making something that goes actually into the live databases and discovers the information from there.
Great, thanks. A question about the business rules engine. That is not there. We have, in all the conversations we've been having with customers, we haven't seen a lot of demand or usage for that, at least in terms of migrating across and having the equivalent. That said, it is something we are looking at. So again, if you have specific use cases, and I guess, particularly, and we may have talked about this before on kind of Logic Apps Live, there are kind of two use cases we see for the business rules engine. One is, again, application configuration, kind of lookup stuff, which there are alternative solutions to that, as I just mentioned. And the other one is obviously using it as a full kind of forward chaining rules engine. That's the one that I would be very interested in your feedback on, because we don't really have a solution, first-party solution in Azure for that today. And again, that's kind of based on kind of the demand signals that we see from customers. So if you need that, then please give us more information, and we'll see what we can do, because we totally understand that it's if you're using the rules engine in BizTalk today, it's something that we could enable to make the migration easier.
I was just going to talk a little bit about the caching here, because there's quite a good discussion going on there. That yes, everyone's exactly right. If you want to use consumption tier APIM, you could just implement Redis cache. You can just turn that on and use an external cache, and you could then use the consumption tier. Again, I think it's a difficult one. How do you find a one-size-fits-all solution? Everyone's got completely different requirements and what they want, and I think the answer here is that different companies will want different setups. So you might say, well, for us, we want to use a Redis cache in the consumption tier, and somebody else might say, well, we're already paying for a premium tier for APIM, and we're happy with the caching in there. So yeah, I think in terms of the SSO migration, I agree with what John was saying, that SSO nowadays, most people aren't using it for single sign-on. They're using it as a config store. Because there's no other config store that's spread automatically across your BizTalk domain that also has caching. My understanding is that Azure App Config is supposed to be that type of config store with failover and redundancy, geographic redundancy, and I thought it was going to have caching as well. I'm not sure about that, but it's it's key value pairs as well, and there are other ways of storing that. So I've looked through the code. So one of the things I was looking at was modifying the APIM policy that does the lookup from Azure App Config, because I've got a little pet project trying to make this run locally, and changing it to use a Redis cache that I've got installed. So yeah, I don't know. I think if you've got feedback on this, if you've got things that you really want to see, ping the team. Ping John and his team, and vote on things, I guess.
Yeah, and with that, because we're almost at the top of the hour, I didn't see anyone voicing kind of an opinion on when we should meet next. I think we'll probably work to do this in a month's time, if that makes sense to everybody, and we'll kind of give an update in terms of where we're at. It'd be great to see you again and kind of start getting your feedback as well once you've had more time to play around with the tool and run it against your MSIs and see what's working and what isn't, so we can kind of work together to improve it. So with that, I think we've answered most of the questions. If we haven't, we'll sort of stay on chat for a few more minutes and keep answering them. But I would say, thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you found this useful, and let's do it again next time. Thank you very much. And thanks team, and thanks Andrew and Dan. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John. Thanks everyone. Bye.